we'll see today, know how the contract testing look like, and how this contract testing is different from other traditional, API testing. So if you see contract, right? So when we say we have a contract, right? So the thing which comes into mind, our mind is like it's a set of rules, basically, right? So it is a set of rules which has to be agreed upon between two parties, right? So if you see in API world, right? So we have consumer and we have a producer, basically. Like, producer is who is actually developing and creating the APIs, and consumer who is actually using the APIs. If we see the world from the consumer side, right? So these are the different tests, basically, right? So we generally perform based on our functional needs, right? So the regular functional test, then maybe we functional test includes like your unit testing, module testing, and all, right? So module level testing, and then we'll have integration test with the provider, and we may have some end-to-end test, right? So contract testing comes into picture when we do actually our integration test with a provider, and the provider may or may not be part of your organization, right? So provider can be another team in your organization, or it can be a third party provider, right? So we need to write basically our integration test with no with the provider, right? So what we'll do, probably we'll write some test with mocks or testables, right? So stubs and mocks, so that we can still proceed with our development, and we may write some real test also. But real test, yeah, again it is costly, because we have to really depend on the availability of the provider, right? So the API should be available, and we should have limits, and limits and all to use those APIs, basically, right? So a real integration test with real provider is bit tricky. Okay, so that's where API contract actually comes as a handy for us, right? So API contract is nothing but a set of rules we define, which both the parties will follow, like consumer, also provider also. Like, let's take an example. For example, we have used this endpoint, right, for Spotify, right? Which one browse and new releases, right? So we give the country code, and a number of releases in the limit field, query parameter, and we hit the API. This is the API, and it will give us some response. So for example, I have two consumers for this API. Just assume very simple case, like consumer A and consumer B. So what is the expectation? Now the expectation from the consumer may differ, right? So based on the application they are building, and based on the context they will be using this particular API. Now consumer A, right? So consumer A is giving a expectation. Okay, so I want two query parameters, basically, right? That should be always there, country and limit. And I want a 200 valid response status code, and I want like artist name and ID in the response body. So that is my expectation, and I have to tell my consumer clearly, like these three are my expectation. So that means this is my this is the term of my contract, basically. Okay, so consumer B says, okay, I also bothered about 200 response. I may not I will not bother about, like, if I'm passing country code or number of limits, or so ever, like query parameters. So I want also status code 400 for invalid response. No, this is my expectation. Maybe in the response body, I don't want artist name or ID and all. I don't care. I want the available market field. Okay, this is another field in that endpoint response. So I want that field. Okay, so maybe you have another consumer C or another consumer D, right? So they might be having their own set of expectation, for each endpoint, right? The single endpoint we are considering, but different consumers might have different set of expectation. So this is like a minimum expectation from the producer, right? See, the Spotify API we are using, right? We are creating app to you as a customer or end customer. You are creating an app. So you are a consumer of Spotify. So Spotify has developed this API and it has kept like, this is the developer documentation. You use it. Now this API will be having returning so many fields basically. This is applicable actually in GraphQL also. In GraphQL also contract is needed, right? So different there it is actually must, because the different although the URL is same, your responses are different, right? So different client may use different parameters there also. Consumers will be having using different parameters. Assume that this is a GraphQL and it is returning artist name and ID, and the other query, second query you are running, it is returning available market, right? So if they are changing any of this, right, so your test will fail basically, or your application, your integration basically test will fail. So this is like a smoke kind of stuff for you. You are not even considering your business logic now. You are considering the minimum things you are expecting from the API. So yeah, so there are basically two things here. Okay, so from the API contract, right? So one is consumer driven and one is producer driven. So from the if I'll start with the consumer driven first. Like, what is a consumer driven contract basically? That means consumer is telling, here is what I need. Okay, so there might be n number of other things, but really don't care. But this is the thing, like these 5 things or these 10 things I really want. So consumer defines a contract. Maybe he is defining, she is defining the contract in their code base, but consumer has to define the contract. Now, how consumer will define the contract, will come to that point. But for time being, assume that is a consumer driven, strategy. You as a consumer have to define your contract. That can be a document, that can be a file, that can be anything, but you have to define. Okay, and provider get notified about that contract. Like you have to inform the provider, okay, that this is the contract I am looking for. Suppose you are a paid customer of Spotify. You have taken their subscription and you really want to create an app using Spotify APIs, right? So you are a valuable customer. Now if you want really to collaborate and uh, reach a common business goal, right, to working together with the Spotify team, as a consumer you have to define the contract and you have to tell the provider that this is what you expecting. So provider can actually run the contracts, and how we will do it, that will tell, but provider will be will verify whether the contract meets their specification. So that means both the side has to work together in a collaborative way. You have to share the contract, you have to share the test basically to verify the contract. So those are the tests, we call it as consumer driven contract test. Now how we will write the contract test, we will tell about that. But in a very high level, assume that you created some test which are like bare minimum test for using that API, and you are giving that test to the provider. So from both the side, you can also run the test to keep yourself updated about the change, and provider also can run those tests and see what is the customer actually expecting. So there are basically pros and cons in consumer driven approach. Okay, so what are the pros? Now risk due to integration can be minimized, right? Because both the parties, like consumer knows what the consumer actually clearly explain what is the expectation, right, to the provider, and provider knows okay, for this particular customer, I have to take care of these things. Now when I do some changes, I have to keep it in mind that these changes has to be intact, right? This fields has to be intact. If I'm making some changes in those fields, I have to notify basically. Okay, and consumer can also focus more on the actual implementation than thinking about what if provider is breaking something, right? So development process will be smooth, it will be more collaborative. Okay, and provider will get quick feedback about the APIs, on needed parameters, right? Suppose there is some issue on those parameters, provider can run the test, and he can get the quick feedback. And provider will be well aware of the client needs without actually reaching them. No, you have provided them the contract, you have provided them the test, basically, to support or to verify those contracts. So they will be where they'll be aware, like, I have this customers, and these customers are using my APIs in this way. Okay, so but in the con side, provider needs to maintain, again, different consumer specific tests, right? So without that, how provider will know which consumer needs what? And they may also need to know their expectations very well, right? So yeah, you can see this as a pros and cons both, because yeah, consumer side, maybe they can collaborate more with the provider side, they can collaborate more on with the consumer, and get exactly what is actually giving them the business, instead of focusing at a short, they will do, okay, I'm releasing new version of the API, I'm making there are the 10-20 changes, and it will affect all the consumers, right? So that they can take small steps, and they can actually, they see, okay, and they are running the test in their environment, they have the contract, and they notify the important clients, basically, right? So okay, we are changing it, probably now the time to change the test, and you can update also your side of the code, basically. So it won't be like last minute information, right? So to update it, like, it will be like a ongoing process, you can say. So suppose you are working with some customers, or some other teams, and you can very well collaborate using this method, like consumer driven contract method. So another side is like provider driven, and that is like, provider says, this is what I can do, like, this is what I can provide. Now I really don't care who will be using what, but no, I can give you my expectation, right? From the provider side expectation. So I have this API, this API has this 100 fields, I can give you what are the type of these fields, basically I can give you a schema of that, I can give you test, which the uh, consumer can actually integrate, basically consumer can integrate with their environment, and consumer can run and build the test to ensure that contract is fulfilled. So in this case, provider will not be maintaining different consumers test, basically provider will maintain the provider test, and it will provide that test, maybe it will provide they can provide also some mocked responses, right? So that the consumer side can actually integrate that in their system. Okay, they can publish their contract, they can publish their testables or mocks, in a shared repository, and they can consumer has to run the test, basically the test provided by the provider. This is a two side of the coin, basically. Okay, so if it is a consumer driven, consumer has to give the contract test to the provider, and provider has to maintain different contract tests for different consumers, basically. And if it is a provider driven, a provider will give the contract, and provider will give the test to the consumer. So consumers has to maintain it, so they have to see, okay, this has this, I bother only about this, I will run maybe a subset of that test, so they can maintain it in that way. So if it is a provider driven, right, so there will be pros and cons again. So provider will be having a full control. Okay, they can share the details with the consumer without even knowing what is consumer actually expecting, right? So many times it happens, right? If a big provider, they might be having so many consumers, and they really don't know what consumer is actually using, what part of their APIs. So what they can give, like, this is my structure, and this is my test, and you can always run this test to make sure nothing get breaks from your side. So cons is again, it ignores the consumer perspective completely. If it is a provider driven, so it at least know things about from a provider point of view, but what is actually consumer is doing, provider will not be aware. But other side, like consumer driven, the provider and consumer both will be aware of their integration strategies basically. Let's see how the contract test, right? So I talk about two types of contract test here, right? So one is consumer driven and one is provider driven, right? So how these contract tests are actually different than no, our regular API test, right? So yeah, so if you see, if you compare side by side, yeah, API test written, we can provider can also write, consumer can also write. Now they will be writing for their own application, right? So contract test also, providers can also write, the consumer can also write, but the context will be different here. Okay, so what is the difference basically? So in API test, when the provider is writing test for their APIs or consumer is writing test for their APIs, no, they will validate the entire API, right? From a functionality point of view or from a business use case point of view, they will verify each and everything, like all the fields, all the responses, and then what is the functionality, the chaining, right? The complete workflows, so everything we verify when we test an API. But when we write some contract, right, so we really don't need to care about all those functionalities, like on a business cases. We'll care about only the minimum things or minimum expectations needed for the integration, basically. So how I can integrate that particular API, it by code, what I need to pass, and what are the parameters, what are the body parameters, query parameters, what are the type of those parameters. So all those things only I need to care. So suppose you have your own APIs, right? You will be writing your own APIs also, and you will be maybe taking some responses from Spotify API for your own APIs, obviously, and you will write the complete functionality and business use cases. And for your API, each and every field is important for you. You will give assertions for each and every field, and you will also give assertions for your business outcome, right? So suppose you are creating some playlist, then updating some update, adding some track to the playlist, then finally that the entire playlist should work basically for a particular user. And then you also want to make sure two different users will not be able to see those playlists until and unless we share it. Okay, so Spotify may not care about that. You have to consider everything basically from your business point of view. But from a contract point of view, right? So in that use case, maybe you will use only one simple API to create a playlist, right? So to create a playlist, what you need to pass? Maybe your artist name or playlist name, right? Or your user ID. So you need to consider only those parameters for your contract test. So that is a subset of your complete test. It is not, you are not testing basically Spotify APIs, testing the your application, right? So you are not their APIs they will test basically. The create playlist API they might have tested already. So you have to integrate basically that API, and to integrate that API, what are the parameters you need? Those parameters should be provided by the provider. So in your validation, you will add those parameters only. Maybe you will add some schema validation or some simple 1 or 2 parameter validation, right? So those things uh, you can do. Okay. So you will not generally consider your business logic or your full functional validations in contract test.